We're going to be looking at a specific case today, one that really serves as a lens into a much larger and frankly a much more disturbing reality about maritime travel.
It's a case that has left a lot of unanswered questions.
The date we're focused on is March 22, 2011. The location is the Disney Wonder cruise ship. And the subject is the disappearance of a 24-year-old crew member named Rebecca Coriam.
It really is a case that remains an open wound for her family, and I think a significant question mark for the entire cruise industry.
Right.
When we discuss Rebecca Coriam, we're not just discussing one missing person. We are really talking about the intersection of international maritime law, corporate liability, and the very specific operational culture of these massive cruise lines.
It's a world unto itself.
It is. When a person steps onto a ship, they're entering a unique legal environment. The protections that you expect on land, they just don't necessarily apply in the same way.
So our mission here is to examine the timeline of that morning, to analyze the physical evidence that was found, and, maybe more importantly, the evidence that was notably absent.
And to explore those systemic issues,
Yeah.
the ones that surround disappearances in international waters.
We have to start with the individual at the center of all this. In a lot of the reports, you'll see her referred to as Bex. She was a British citizen, and she was working as a youth worker on the ship.
And it's significant to note, right from the start, that this was the first such incident in the entire history of the Disney Cruise Line.
That's a huge deal for a brand like Disney.
It's immense. Disney is a brand that is absolutely predicated on total control, on safety, and on this very carefully curated, family-friendly image. For a crew member to simply vanish from one of their vessels, well, that represents a catastrophic deviation from their standard operations.
And the details surrounding what happened, they're just inconsistent. We have what's described as a distress call captured on CCTV, but there's no audio to go with it.
We have physical evidence like a pair of flip-flops found near a pool, which, as it turns out, reportedly didn't even belong to her.
And then we have this official explanation, an idea about a rogue wave that was offered up by the ship's captain.
A theory that experts have subsequently and very strongly challenged.
So what's the core complication here?
The primary complication in this case is jurisdictional. It's a complete puzzle. You have a British citizen
Okay.
employed on a ship that's registered in the Bahamas,
Right.
operating out of a United States port, and at the time it was sailing in international waters just off the coast of Mexico.
So who's in charge?
Well, that's the question. When an incident occurs in such a multifaceted environment, just determining who has investigative primacy becomes a significant, sometimes insurmountable obstacle to establishing the truth.
To really understand the implications of her disappearance, I think we first need to understand Rebecca Coriam herself. Let's start at the beginning. She was born on March 11th, 1987, in Chester, England.
Yes, at the Countess of Chester Hospital. And her background, from everything we can see, indicates a really stable, very supportive upbringing.
Who was in her immediate family?
She grew up with her parents, Mike and Anne Maria, her sister Rachel, and 2 foster brothers. And that detail about the foster siblings, it's actually quite relevant.
How so?
Well, it suggests a family environment that was inclusive and probably required a high degree of social adaptability, of patience traits that, she would later use in her career.
And the character descriptions we have of her are just so consistent across all the documentation.
Incredibly consistent, cheerful, upbeat. She had this natural inclination toward working with people, especially with children.
She graduated from Chester Catholic High School, and then she went on to study sports science at Plymouth University.
And that academic background in sports science is material to our analysis here. It's not just a random fact.
It tells you something about her.
It tells you she was physically capable and disciplined. She wasn't a sedentary person. What's more, in her youth, she worked at the Chester Zoo.
Her relatives also worked there, I believe.
That's right. And her grandparents, Kevin and Dolores, actually have a memorial bench there on the grounds. It just demonstrates this strong connection she had to her local community and a history of reliable employment in, physically demanding roles.
She also had this commitment to service and to structured environments. In her teenage years, she joined the Air Cadets.
Specifically, the 610 City of Chester Squadron. And she didn't just join, she eventually held a staff volunteer position.
Which is not a minor role.
Not at all. The Air Cadets is an organization that instills discipline, respect for the chain of command, and a real adherence to procedure. A staff volunteer position is not something that's given to someone who is unreliable or erratic. It suggests she understood protocol.
And that's important. Why?
It's very important when we later consider some of the theories particularly those suggesting she might have been acting recklessly or, against regulations on the ship. It just doesn't fit her profile.
And she had international experience even before she started with Disney.
She did. She spent 4 months in the United States, in Maine, teaching sports at a place called Camp America. She also went on to undertake youth studies at Liverpool Hope University.
So when you look at that whole profile,
When you put it all together, sports science, youth studies, the Camp America experience, the Air Cadets discipline, she is the ideal candidate for a youth worker role on a major cruise line.
she checks all the boxes.
She was qualified, she was experienced, and she was physically fit. The perfect hire.
So in June of 2010, she interviews for the position in London, and of course she's successful. She then travels to the Disney theme parks in Florida for training.
And Disney's training is famously rigorous. It covers safety, brand standards, emergency procedures, everything. Her first assignment was a pretty standard 4-month contract, cruise to the Bahamas.
And after that,
Following that, she returned home to England for a 2-month break before joining the Disney Wonder, which at that time was based in the Port of Los Angeles.
so this was a different assignment, a different route, visiting ports along the Mexican Riviera, transiting the Panama Canal.
A completely different environment. But during this period, she did return home to Chester for 2 weeks to attend her grandfather's funeral.
And that visit.
That visit was the final time her family saw her in person. Upon her return to the ship, she just resumed her duties as a youth worker. And that's a role that requires, maintaining incredibly high energy levels, managing children's activities, which implies she was under almost constant social observation during her working hours.
Which brings us to the specific timeline of the disappearance itself. The Disney Wonder departed Los Angeles on March 21st, 2011. It was headed for a cruise along the Mexican Riviera, and Rebecca was maintaining contact with her family.
Right. While internet connectivity at sea in 2011 wasn't what it is today, it was still possible. She used Facebook and Skype to stay in touch. On March 21st, the day of departure, she sent a Facebook message to her parents.
And what did it say?
Just that she would call them the following day, a very normal routine message.
Her mother replied to that message, but then nothing. 12 hours elapsed without a subsequent response from Rebecca.
And her mother noted that this silence was uncharacteristic. Rebecca was typically very responsive. It was the first small sign that something might be wrong.
The date of the incident is March 22, 2011. The ship was navigating off the coast of Mexico en route to Puerto Vallarta and Cabo San Lucas.
And the first operational indication of a problem occurred at 9 o'clock in the morning, Pacific Daylight Time. That's when Rebecca failed to report for her scheduled shift.
In that industry, and especially with a company like Disney, punctuality is everything. It's not something that's taken lightly.
Absolutely not. Absence from a shift triggers immediate protocols. So her cabin was checked, it was found empty, pages were issued over the ship's public address system.
And there was no response.
No response at all. Now, an initial account from a crew member, an early rumor really, suggested she might have gone overboard at 3 o'clock in the morning.
But that turned out to be wrong.
Completely wrong. The investigation eventually uncovered CCTV footage that places her alive and on board at 5:45 a.m. This footage serves as the primary visual evidence in the case, and it completely refutes that earlier timeline.
So we should really examine the content of that footage in detail. The time is 5:45 a.m. The location is an area known as the crew lounge, and Rebecca is seen speaking on an internal ship telephone.
Her demeanor in this footage is the subject of so much analysis. She appears visibly distressed, upset.
And during the call, another person enters the frame.
A young male crew member approaches her. He appears to ask her if she's okay, a very normal interaction.
And even though there's no audio recording, we have an idea of what she said.
We do. Lip-reading analysis indicates she responded with the words, "Yeah, fine."
Yeah, fine. But her body language will tell a different story.
It might. Following this brief interaction, she terminates the call. She's then seen pushing her hair back and placing her hands into her back pockets.
And her parents have confirmed these were things she did.
Yes. They confirmed these were habitual mannerisms for her, which helps to verify her identity in the footage. But there is a significant discrepancy regarding her clothing.
What's the issue?
The clothing she's wearing in the video, it just appears significantly too large for her. This observation has led to a lot of speculation among her friends and other crew members that the clothes did not belong to her.
So that raises a critical question.
It does. Why was she wearing ill-fitting clothing at 5:45 in the morning while exhibiting signs of distress on an internal phone call? It suggests a major disruption of her normal routine. Something was clearly wrong.
And that footage, that's it. That's the last confirmed sighting of Rebecca Coriam.
That's it. She hangs up the phone and walks out of the frame of the camera. After that moment, there is no subsequent record of her presence anywhere on the ship.
So you have this gap.
A critical gap. There's a gap between that 5:45 a.m. sighting and the 9 a.m. shift she was supposed to start, where her movements are completely unaccounted for. The footage definitively proves she was on board nearly 3 hours after that initially rumored 3:00 a.m. incident time.
Which narrows the window.
It narrows the window in which the disappearance must have occurred.
So once it's confirmed she's missed her shift and she can't be found, the crew conducts a search of the vessel.
A full ship-wide search. And at the same time, the United States Coast Guard and the Mexican Navy were notified. They began conducting searches of the international waters along the ship's trajectory.
What those searches?
Those searches yielded no results. No body was ever recovered, and no debris consistent with a person entering the water was ever located.
And this brings us right back to that issue of jurisdiction.
Exactly. The Disney Wonder is registered in the Bahamas.
Which means, consequently, the investigative authority was the Royal Bahamas Police Force.
This is a standard practice in the shipping industry, known as flags of convenience. Ship owners register their vessels in nations like the Bahamas or Panama or Liberia, primarily for tax advantages and for regulatory flexibility regarding labor laws.
But there's a major consequence to that.
A huge consequence. When a crime or a serious incident occurs on board one of these ships, the investigation falls into the jurisdiction of that flag state. And these nations, with all due respect, often do not possess the investigative resources or the specialized global reach of agencies like the FBI or Scotland Yard.
And the timeline of the Bahamian investigation itself has drawn a lot of criticism.
A great deal of criticism. The detective assigned to the case, he didn't travel to the ship immediately. He actually waited until the ship returned to its port in Los Angeles, which was 3 days after Rebecca disappeared.
So the scene is already cold by then.
Very cold. Now, official reports state that the detective spent several days on board conducting his investigation.
But the family says something different.
Rebecca's parents dispute this. They state the detective was only on board for a single day. What's more, it's reported that he interviewed only a few crew members and, quite shockingly, did not interview a single passenger.
Not interviewing any passengers is, well, it's a significant omission given the sheer number of people on a cruise ship.
It's a massive omission. It implies a presumption, right from the start, that the incident was either internal to the crew or was accidental rather than criminal. In a missing person case where the subject was last seen visibly distressed, excluding the entire passenger, manifests from the inquiry, severely limits the potential for gathering any independent witness testimony.
And we should also talk about the treatment of Rebecca's parents during this immediate aftermath. It's also been documented.
It has. They were flown from their home in England to Los Angeles. Disney arranged for their transport, but it was in a vehicle with tinted blacked-out windows.
And when they got to the ship?
They were brought on board through a rarely used side entrance, and only after all the other passengers had disembarked for the day.
That sounds like they were being hidden.
Well, the protocol is clearly designed to minimize visibility and to manage the corporate image during a crisis. For the family, however, it must have created a profound sense of isolation and containment.
They then met with the ship's captain.
Yes. He expressed his condolences, and it was then that he presented the rogue wave theory. He suggested to them that Rebecca had been washed overboard by a large wave while she was near the crew pool area.
And we will definitely come back to analyze the viability of that theory.
We will. The parents were also, interestingly, introduced to the woman Rebecca had been speaking to on the phone during that CCTV footage.
So because of these, let's call them perceived inadequacies of the official investigation, journalistic inquiries began to take place.
They did. In October of 2011, a journalist named John Ronson, writing for the Guardian newspaper, he boarded the Disney Wonder.
As a passenger?
Yes, he booked passage on the ship to retrace its route. His objective was to make very discreet inquiries among the staff to see what he could find out.
And what did he find?
He reported encountering an atmosphere of real apprehension and silence regarding the incident. People did not want to talk about it.
He noted that several crew members refused to even provide their names. One bartender is quoted as saying, "It didn't happen. You know that's the answer I have to give."
Think about that statement. It suggests a coordinated, top-down effort to suppress any discussion of the event.
There was another prevailing sentiment among the crew, this belief that and I'm quoting again, Disney knows exactly what happened. Everything here is taped.
Which reflects a perception among the staff that the ship's surveillance coverage is comprehensive, that nothing can happen without being seen.
Ronson initially had his own theory. He hypothesized she might have slipped while jogging on Deck 4, as the railings there were quite low, and she was known to be a runner.
It was a logical starting point, but he subsequently discarded that theory. The jogging track on Deck 4 is heavily monitored by security cameras. It's a public area. A fall or any incident in that location would almost certainly have been recorded. In fact, when Ronson mentioned this theory to a deck worker, the worker corrected him.
They told him what?
He told him that the widely accepted narrative among the crew, the story they all told each other, was that she went overboard from the crew pool on Deck 5.
And this theory, the one about the crew pool, it relies partly on information from an informant, someone known only as Melissa.
That's right. Melissa contacted Ronson using a pseudonym. She claimed that on the day following Rebecca's disappearance, flowers were placed on the wall near the crew pool.
By who?
By the company, she claimed. And she expressed confusion about this gesture because no official explanation had been provided to the crew about what had happened or why the flowers were there.
So Ronson went to examine the crew pool on Deck 5 himself.
He did. It's an area that's visible from the floor of Deck 10. And what Ronson observed was that the pool is surrounded by high steel walls.
What's the purpose of those walls?
They're designed to block the view, for crew privacy. But their height makes an accidental fall highly improbable.
And what about cameras?
Ronson also noted the presence of security cameras mounted in that area.
So if she had gone over the wall, the camera should have captured the event. If she jumped, she would have had to physically scale a high steel wall, which would also, presumably, be visible to the cameras.
Exactly. Ronson found the whole accidental fall scenario to be physically unlikely. But a crew member he spoke to tried to explain it by citing rough seas, suggesting the ship pitched violently and tossed her overboard.
Okay, so we have to verify the sea conditions for that specific night.
And this is a key point. A private investigator named John Anderson later reviewed the official maritime records for that evening. And the data, it's unequivocal. It indicates that the seas were normal.
Not rough.
Not rough at all. There were no storm conditions, no heavy pitching recorded that would support the theory of someone being thrown over a high steel wall by the motion of the ship.
Which brings us to the physical evidence, and specifically the anomalies surrounding these flip-flops. A flip-flop was found in the crew pool area, and it was cited as evidence of her being there.
The flip-flop is a very contested piece of evidence. It was claimed to have been found at the scene. But when the item was eventually returned to Rebecca's parents, both they and the informant Melissa identified some significant inconsistencies.
What were they? Melissa said they were too large, for one.
Too large, and she also noted they were, and I quote, pink and flowery and Hawaiian, which was a style she claimed Rebecca never, ever wore.
So the discrepancy goes beyond just the style.
Much deeper. In 2016, private investigators discovered that another crew member's name and cabin number were actually written on the footwear.
Wait, someone else's name was on them?
Yes, which strongly implies that the flip-flops being used to place Rebecca at the scene of her disappearance actually belonged to a different person entirely.
That is a stunning detail.
It's a critical detail. And furthermore, the family later learned that no forensic testing, no DNA analysis, no fingerprinting was ever conducted on the footwear.
In a missing person investigation, that seems unbelievable.
Failing to forensically test a key item found at a suspected scene is a significant, a fundamental procedural failure.
Okay, let's turn to the phone call from the CCTV footage. Crew members told John Ronson that that call was taped.
That's what they believed. Now, Disney has never officially confirmed the existence of such a tape. Legal strategies in these matters often involve neither confirming nor denying the existence of evidence unless you're compelled by a court. But the crew's belief in its existence is persistent.
And there has been a lot of speculation about the content of that call. Melissa, the informant, she claimed it was a conversation with a mutual friend about relationship difficulties.
Yes, Melissa described a very intense relationship that had deteriorated, suggesting that emotional distress might explain why Rebecca was up and navigating the ship at that early hour.
The parents also received some information, I believe, regarding a potential love triangle involving a young woman and an older man, though that remains unverified.
It does. And we must also reconsider the shorts that she was seen wearing in the CCTV footage. As we said, they appeared too large. So if the flip-flops were not hers and the clothes she was wearing were ill-fitting, it suggests a major departure from her standard behavior and her appearance. It paints a picture of someone in a very unusual situation.
So let's try to organize this and address the formal theories that have been put forward. First, there's the theory of suicide. Her family strongly disputes this.
And the dispute is grounded in her behavior and her future planning. When her parents were finally allowed to access her cabin, they found passes she had bought for Disneyland Paris
Why is that significant?
because she had purchased them as a surprise gift for her parents and her sister.
And the purchase of gifts for a future family trip is, well, it's generally seen as inconsistent with the psychological profile of someone who is planning to take their own life.
It is. Additionally, her communication with her mother on Facebook had been continuous and completely normal right up until the messages stopped. There were no flagged indicators, no cries for help, nothing like that in her correspondence.
Okay, so next is the accident theory, or the rogue wave theory. This was the captain's official explanation.
This theory posits that a freak wave washed her over the wall at the crew pool. But the physical counter-arguments are very strong.
Let's list them. The walls were high.
Very high. The sea conditions, as we've established, were recorded as normal. And furthermore, a wave of sufficient magnitude to strike Deck 5 and wash a person over a solid steel wall would likely cause significant structural damage, or at the very least, leave massive amounts of water damage on the ship.
And no such damage was ever reported.
None.
That brings us to the third theory, foul play. This is a perspective that's been supported by some prominent political figures in the UK.
Yes, Chris Matheson, who is a former member of Parliament, and John Prescott, the former Deputy Prime Minister, have both expressed very serious concerns.
What did Matheson say?
Matheson stated his belief, quite plainly, that she was a victim of a crime, potentially a sexual assault or even murder. He asserted that compelling evidence exists in the original reports to support this conclusion.
And Prescott.
Prescott also stated his belief that she was thrown overboard.
Matheson used a very direct phrase. He said, "It smells like a crime."
It is a direct assessment, and it aligns with a certain kind of logic. If an accident is physically improbable and suicide is psychologically inconsistent with her character, then the remaining probability is that of an external agency. Foul play.
There was also a reported sighting of her, I believe, in Venice in 2012.
That's right. About a year after she disappeared, Rebecca's father received an email from a woman who claimed she was, in her words, 85% certain that she saw Rebecca in Venice with a dark-haired man.
And while the family must have found this distressing, there's a major problem with that theory.
A huge one. Her passport was located in her cabin on the ship.
So traveling internationally without a passport, especially in the post-9/11 security environment, is extremely difficult, if not impossible.
Exactly. The presence of her passport on the ship strongly mitigates against the theory that she somehow left the vessel alive and managed to travel to Europe undetected.
This entire case really brings to light the systemic issue of these flags of convenience.
It's the central problem. A flag of convenience allows a ship that's owned by a company in, say, the United States, to operate under the laws of another country, like the Bahamas. And this creates an incredibly complex and often murky legal environment.
So when an incident occurs,
The investigating authority is the country of registration, not the country of the ship's owner, or, importantly, the country of the victim.
because the Wonder was registered in the Bahamas, the investigation was Bahamian.
And Stephen Mosley, another MP, he described the Bahamian investigation as appalling. He characterized the Royal Bahamas Police Force as being almost toothless in this context. They just lack the resources and the global reach comparable to the FBI or to the UK authorities.
Critics have argued that this system basically allows cruise lines to manage the outcome of investigations on their ships.
That is the central criticism. Mike Penning, who was the UK's Minister for Shipping at the time, was quoted as saying the company was more interested in getting the ship back to sea than in a thorough investigation.
The business has to continue.
Commercial imperatives, maintaining the schedule, maintaining the revenue stream, can come into direct conflict with the requirements of a proper, thorough criminal inquiry.
And advocacy groups, like International Cruise Victims, have been highlighting these issues for years.
They have. Kendall Carver, the founder of that group, he notes that 170 passengers and crew disappeared from cruise ships just between the years 2000 and 2011.
That's a staggering number.
It is, and he points out a fundamental structural conflict of interest. The security officers on these ships are employees of the cruise line. They are not independent law enforcement agents. Their primary loyalty is to their employer.
The family did eventually take legal action against Disney. In 2015 and 2016, a settlement was reached.
Yes, they settled a civil claim against Disney out of court. The terms included an undisclosed sum of money. But crucially, it also included an agreement that prevents them from discussing the case publicly.
Which is standard practice.
It's very standard in these kinds of civil settlements. But the effect is that it effectively silences the family regarding any new information they might have or any advocacy they might wish to do.
But the case itself, it did prompt some legislative changes, didn't it?
It did. It had an impact. In the UK, Mike Penning announced that the Marine Accident Investigation Branch would, from then on, investigate the deaths and disappearances of any British citizens on vessels worldwide.
And in the U.S.?
In the U.S., there was parallel legislation signed by President Obama that gave the FBI the authority to investigate the deaths or disappearances of American citizens at sea, regardless of where the ship is registered.
And yet, today, Rebecca Coriam remains a missing person. The investigation is technically still ongoing?
Technically. But the family reports that all meaningful communication with authorities has ceased. The standard response they receive is that the investigation is ongoing, but no new information is ever provided.
So we've summarized a case that involves a young woman who vanished from what should have been a secure environment. We have CCTV footage showing her in distress. We have physical evidence that appears contradictory and possibly planted.
And we have a police investigation that was, by almost any measure, limited in its scope and its thoroughness.
It's the testimony from Melissa, the informant, that really sticks with you. This idea that if the ship is covered in cameras, as the crew believed,
then the absence of footage is itself a piece of evidence. If the cameras did not see her leave the ship and they did not see her fall and she's no longer on the ship, well, the gap in that narrative is substantial and deeply troubling.
It just raises these fundamental questions about the ability to secure justice when you're in international waters.
The ocean remains a jurisdictionally complex and in some ways a lawless space. Even on a vessel with thousands of people, these legal frameworks can create gaps in accountability that are large enough for a person to simply disappear into.
Thanks for listening.